Welcome, campers. It's another Wednesday. It's Tom Cagley and Jeremy Willets here to talk to you more about mastering work intake. So, Tom, I think when we last talked to everybody, we were getting ready to go dig some trails, weren't we?
Yeah, I can't tell you how bad the blisters are. But Jeremy, I have a problem today, and it's driving me crazy. My bosses are screaming at me, and I'm a very conflict avoidant kind of person. But I've got they're telling me to do three different things. One is just going absolutely frothing at the mouth, wants the plot around the flagpole. They want it weeded, get all the weeds out of the flowers. Right. And it's like, oh my gosh, that has to get done, and it just going crazy. Another has just reminded me that my job and my bonus is tied up with marching the campers. You think this was a weight loss camp? I don't get it. But we've hit that 20,000 steps a day thing for a while, regardless of the weather. But just frothing at the mouth, and also, my other boss is yelling at me because he really wants the plans, the strategic plan done for the board meeting, which is next week. I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose my bonus. I don't want to get screamed at anymore about the darn weeds. I hate weeds. And I know that I should be working on the strategic plan.
Right.
What do I do?
I'm really surprised, first off, that you only have 5 bosses. I thought you had more than that. If I think about the different structure of our camp organization, to say nothing of the parents and the way the parents of some of these campers have gone after us to do things. I've fielded phone calls in the middle of the night where, much like you, there's yelling in the phone about needing to do something urgently, but trying to keep sight of those important things is challenging too. So I think, Tom, what it sounds to me like is that you're dealing with a bit of an urgency and importance problem. You might have a challenge there. We might have to unpack some of that together.
Well, okay. Well, I think we better, because very frankly, it's making me crazy. And I'm out of those little pills that you gave me to reduce my anxiety.
Well, I think what you just teed up, Tom, is pretty similar to how people that we work with feel sometimes when it comes to this whole work intake thing. Whether they have one of their 5 or 10 bosses coming to yell at them about something, or they get, start to think about those longer term strategic things. I think this is one of those challenges that we've talked about before when it comes to work intake, and one of those primary causes of work intake problems. And so if you've been following along with our past camp sessions, we've done 4 of these so far. This is number 5, where we're going to talk about urgency and importance.
So let's hit it. So urgency and importance, and why is this important?
Yeah. So Tom gave you a taste, I think, right there of what urgency feels like. The person who yells the loudest. And so I would bet that if every one of us thought back to a time in our professional career, we could think about a time where this happened to us, whether it was an executive that showed up in our cubicle one sunny afternoon and yelled at us to do something, perhaps a shoulder tap, perhaps it's a customer. So in this, I've dealt a lot in my career, Tom, with teams and organizations who sometimes are beholden to the needs and whims of certain customers. And when that customer, for whether good or bad, when they raise their voice and yell, whatever yelling looks like, whether yelling is literally like the president of one customer calling up our company and saying, I need you to do this or else, or if it's a different flavor of yelling, that's one thing I've seen in my career pretty commonly with product development.
We have common phrases for this. I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Yes, sir.
I mean, it is that common. And again, the hyperbole of the opening was really to draw attention. I think we're all conflict avoidant. None of us want to get that kind of pressure on us. It's easy just to react and jump the queue and start on something. It really does. It has an incredible impact on, well, we put it here, business value delivered. And how does it impact, value delivered? You're making the yelling go down, aren't you?
Sure. And that might make you feel good, whether you as a person or you as a team or you as an organization. It might make you feel good in the short term because you can kind of, reflect on each day and kind of go, well, gee, I made that person happy or I made that customer happy because I did the thing that they were yelling about. So thank goodness I'm not going to get yelled at tomorrow. But inevitably, what you'll find is a pattern of just continuing to be yelled at, and that work continues to be inserted in front of the work that you actually need to do because, for example, it might be a really important strategic thing. And so what inevitably happens is that important strategic stuff gets pushed off, gets pushed off, gets pushed off in favor of doing that work that is perceived as urgent because someone is on the phone, someone is at your desk, somebody's tapping you at the shoulder telling you you need to do that now. And that does not lead necessarily to great long-term outcomes.
Late last year, I was called in to find out what was going wrong with a team that the CIO basically intimated that if they didn't get their act together, he was going to find a place for all that work to go that was at least 7 or 8 time zones away, which meant that none of those people would be currently employed.
Right.
So, the whole, we've harped on this in the first 4. We'll get to it a little later on. I went and looked, and just, a couple of conversations are important, but going and basically looking at and listening to what was going on. How was work being prioritized? Are there criteria? Is there a process to take in work? All of those things. Well, lo and behold, the way things were happening, it was a pretty common approach. They were using a fairly rigorous, continuous flow kind of approach. But what would happen is over a period of time, none of the stuff in the release that was targeted for the release would get done. It would be partially done. It would all be started. But what was happening is that they were reacting to active problems that were coming in every day, and they'd get a call. They'd get a call from someone who was wearing a white vest and had a MD attached to their name. And very frankly, it was assumed that was always the most important thing. It was, we are supposed to do things that are, human life and safety. And, far be it from me to say that's a bad thing, right? But nobody qualified that. And so they were doing all these things and nothing was getting done. They had a process problem. They also had a problem where the thought was that the team lead thought he was doing exactly what it was going to take to get him to become a manager.
Yeah. This one's a really interesting one too, because the people who are often yelling the loudest, when they realize that when they yell loud, their work will get done, it reinforces that behavior.
Of course it does. That's basic human behavior, isn't it?
It makes them realize that they will keep doing that same thing until somebody either like us or a team or an organization steps in and says, hold on, we understand your request. Let's prioritize that against the rest of the work we have to do, because that's a very different conversation than dropping everything and just agreeing to do the work.
What do you mean by prioritize? In priority, the whole idea of prioritization can have multiple meanings. When you use that term, what does that mean to you?
Well, let's talk about that word in the context of that picture on the bottom right of this slide. I think that's a good place to go with this, and I can tell a brief story on this. But so first, the bottom right picture is perhaps something you've seen before in the past. It's the Eisenhower matrix. I don't know if this is like a copyrighted phrase that our former.
No, he's quite dead, and he it got coined back in the 1950s.
Yeah, he also was an avid golfer too, Tom. I think we were just talking about golf before this call started. But anyway, so this is like a thing that the former president of the United States portended to use to try and quantify and classify his work. So it's really like understanding the intersection of urgency and importance. And this quadrant is meant to reflect whether work is urgent and important, not urgent and important, not urgent and not important, and the other one, which is not important but urgent. And so, go ahead.
Yeah. So the stuff that's not important and not urgent, you should do that first, right?
Sometimes it feels that way. I mean, if there's an email at the top of your inbox that is just something you can knock out quickly and it feels good to knock it out quickly, you don't even give it a second thought. So I'll admit I'm guilty of doing this stuff versus what, our former president recommends, which is eliminate it, get rid of it, find a way to not do it.
The construct, right? And I think the Eisenhower matrix is a mechanism to think through, to stop, take a breath, and actually start to think. But you point out something again that I think goes back to human nature, that it is sometimes it gives you a really good feeling.
It does.
To check stuff off the list. And our friend Susan Parente has even gone as far as to say, you know what? I keep a number of things on my to-do list that are probably in that. They're quick wins, quote unquote. Quick wins might be code for not urgent, not important. Might not be, but they're quick wins that I can knock off in between things so that I can feel good about the day. But again, they're using an approach. The Eisenhower matrix is just one approach. And obviously, if things are truly urgent and important, you need to do them, right? If they aren't that urgent, then you can schedule them. But the rest of that stuff, the stuff that isn't important, if it needs to go somewhere else, if at all possible. Anywhere from just getting rid of it to, finding someone else down the list to do it.
Yeah, so let's flip into story mode here around the campfire. So I remember a time, probably my first exposure to the Eisenhower matrix was maybe 10 years or so ago. I was working with a team that did not really have a common understanding of priority with the product owner. I could tell that they were not totally aligned with understanding what was on the backlog, understanding why things are important. So I don't know where I got this idea from, but what we did during our sprint retrospective was to put the Eisenhower matrix on the whiteboard. I printed off all of the story cards that were in Jira, and I gave them to the developers. And I said, hey, developers, go hang those up in the quadrant that you think they pertain to, like whether you think this particular work item was important, urgent, important, not urgent, not important, urgent, or not either of those things. And so they did. And what I eventually saw was that they put a lot of things in the important and urgent column. And so I had them do that pass. Then I had the PO get up and readjust things to reflect his view of reality. And it went from the team perceiving every single thing in their backlog as important and urgent to a much different spread across the work items for that particular team. And I think it's certainly more than one or two light bulbs went off in terms of team members and product owners understanding priority. I think we even came up with like maybe one or two items that in hindsight we shouldn't have done at all.
So I like that. It gives it something very tangible. Where do you think the problem really lies in that story?
I think the problem in that particular story was in two places. I think there was a backlog problem. I think there was stuff in the backlog that ultimately didn't need to be there. But I also think it was a communication challenge. I think that, the team as an entity and the product owner as an entity did not have really crisp communication around this whole urgency and importance thing. I think the team perceived that everything is urgent, everything is important. And, we're treating every single backlog item and every single conversation as like high stakes make or break. Whereas once they sat down and talked to the product owner, they were able to calibrate their definitions better on what was actually urgent to resolve and what was actually important.
So I agree. I think it sounds a lot like a communication problem rather than perhaps a process problem. And that, the communication part brings us back to people. Sometimes this is really and truly a people problem, not a process problem.
Yeah, and it's much different if you are using an Eisenhower matrix for yourself, for your own to-do list. I think at some point in my life, I changed my Trello board columns to reflect the Eisenhower matrix and tried that approach, and that was helpful. But it's much different to do this on your own versus doing it with a group of people, because that gives you a chance to reflect and retrospect on what actually was urgent, what actually is important.
Well, it also gives you different perspectives. It's easy to have that conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
Especially if you talk to your hands.
I mean, no surprise here that we're going to have a Dwight Eisenhower quote. I mean, again, we just take a look at the Eisenhower matrix and deconstructed that a little bit. So this is like some of the sage wisdom that exists. So what is important is seldom urgent, and what is urgent is seldom important. I mean, this feels pretty Marcus Aurelius-y as well in terms of its like philosophical nature. No?
I agree 100%. And you could see a degree of stoicism in that. I mean, the idea, right? The idea is to step back and make an assessment, to have that conversation, to have a definition of what's important, at least in your own mind, and what urgent is, and try to separate the two. By separating the two, you can start then to focus on what's important. If we go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, there were three things. I'm going to suggest to you that weeding that front garden is probably, it might be urgent, but it's probably not the most important thing on my plate to do today.
Right. Yeah, and I've to tie this back a little bit into software product development. I've seen this particular challenge a lot when it comes to teams that have to do kind of service work, whether it's bug triage or solving issues that come in from customers, because inevitably what happens is a lot of those teams that I've seen and worked with get tasked with doing two things: triage all the new stuff that's coming in, but then plug away at longer term stuff, whether it's longer term like feature development, longer term tool improvement. And what inevitably happens in almost every case that I see is the stuff that is important, that strategic, long term, develop a new feature, maintain our set of tools, advance those to the next level, those inevitably get deprioritized because anything that comes in is perceived as an urgent, I must do everything.
Agreed. Another place that this type of perception problem occurs is when teams have multiple bosses, whether it's multiple product owners or just, a team lead, a division manager, or, other kinds of managers all filtering work into a single team. So I agree. And I've seen the whole idea of teams doing, bugs and maintenance and enhancements, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a juggling act. And that's really where I think without a very crisp process and a highly disciplined approach to dealing with it, it does fall into whoever has the most status in the organization and whoever screams the loudest gets the ring off of the carousel.
Yep, totally agree. We haven't heard any Stephen Covey thus far in our summer camp series, but this is a good one. I mean, Stephen Covey, the legendary author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that's probably on your bookshelf somewhere, no?
It's there right next to The 8th Habit, which is also his. Yeah, and 2 copies of 7 Habits and 1 copy of The 8th Habit.
Yeah. Another quote that I think has a whiff of stoicism as well, too. Most of us spend too much time on what is urgent and not enough on what is important. So yeah, it's very similar to the Eisenhower quote we just saw on the last slide. And I'll admit this is the way I feel sometimes at work, whether it's compromising on longer term development goals that I have for myself or compromising on something else. Sometimes I just feel a victim to the tyranny of the urgent.
And if you, and you made an interesting expansion. We're generally talking about work intake at teams and departments and corporate levels, but all of us are our own entity in our own right? So managing what's important to us individually at the same time as what's urgent for us, or it becomes even more complicated. So I have a personal backlog. I know you have a personal backlog. We have a book backlog. You have a work backlog. I have a work backlog. All of this stuff has to compete. And, sometimes we do fall into the habit. So when we fall into this habit of spending too much time on what's urgent, what do you think the long-term impact at an individual level is?
Well, sure. And I'll give you a tangible example of this. So I think the long-term impact is not reaching your full potential as an employee, as an individual, as a human being. I think that's pretty scary stuff if you think about mortality and about your time on this planet. I think I've seen this particular pattern quite a bit when it comes to the concept of performance and when the concept of like performance goals. So worked with a lot of teams and organizations over my career where people have work to do, whether it's like stories or bugs or features or epics or whatever you want to call them. That's kind of where they spend a lot of their time on the daily, but they also have longer term goals. Maybe they want to become a better Java developer, a better C# developer. They want to become a tech lead. They want to be an architect, perhaps, or they want to shift careers completely and become a product owner or a product manager or a scrum master. Inevitably, what I've seen with a lot of those folks is they write the goal down, they write that important, perhaps life-changing goal down, and they mean to get to it. They try to get to it. They have every intent to get to it. But the tyranny of stories, sprints, releases, features, etc., all of that work tends to take up all of their time and mental bandwidth. And before they know it, they realize 5 years have gone by and they've made no progress on some of those important goals that could potentially have changed their life.
Okay, this is a non-work related personal story. Back in, I'd say 1992, I decided to start studying to become an amateur, to get a different class of amateur radio license.
Yeah.
An extra class license. I think it was 1991. And I have the book over there, the original book that I studied from. Well, I actually passed that test, 2 months ago. It was on my list. Matter of fact, it was on my list for about 5 years, and I took it off the list because I wasn't getting to it. Just too many other things going on. Get this degree, get this certification, blah, 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 blah. I got it, last month. Finally got around to it. So sometimes things can come back, but it does change. Again, that's fairly superfluous, but it does change the trajectory of your life.
Yeah.
I must point out that somebody that I found that is just laser focused, focusing on building a business is Jeremy Berrio, the other Jeremy. And sometimes it drives me crazy, but it's his laser focus, and he is keeping what's important ahead of what's urgent. And he's making a lot of progress to doing that. It really, by focusing on what's important, you really end up delivering, to something that can change your life.
Yeah. Let's talk
about how do we get better.
Yeah, let's talk about how we get better. So, like a lot of these slides, you've got to be aware, you've got to observe. So, in some of the software-centric examples that Tom and I pointed out, you probably have to understand what the longer-term strategic initiatives are. You probably need to understand how the organization is making progress towards those, how the team is making progress towards those. But then you also need to understand what's going on the daily. What are people doing daily? How much time are they investing daily, weekly, monthly, sprintly, quarterly, yearly into achieving these longer term strategic goals? You can visualize that. That's like a flow distribution visual, correct, Tom?
The whole the cumulative flow diagram
That too.
for this kind of approach really is it lasers you in. It tells you what you have. It tells you where you're working. Um, People like Cal Newport and other, and I'll do this in air quotes, productivity experts strongly, and I coming more and more to the conclusion that they're right, is that you block time on your calendar. You decide, you go through, you create that definition of what's urgent and important, and then you block your calendar and you focus on what's important.
Yeah, that's a great practice. It's a practice that not everybody does, but I know when I try and schedule a meeting at work, and I know that when I'm dealing with somebody who has long blocks of time on their calendar, it's typically not I have a bunch of meetings stacked up. It's typically I want to reserve time for me to focus on the things that I know are important, because otherwise, if I don't, people will take advantage of that open time and they will book my time and use it for something that may or may not be urgent and or important.
But it's certainly urgent. And Jeremy, I thought our jobs in the corporate world were to have meetings.
They can be. I struggled yesterday when I found an issue with one of our tools that we use internally. I struggled to understand whether it was an urgent or important issue, and ultimately I determined that it was. And so I put 15 minutes of time on the calendars of the people I need to talk to them. So instead of reserving like a large chunk, I reserved a small chunk. I did my homework in advance. We'll have that conversation this afternoon. I'm expecting to use that 15 minutes to really get people to drive to a decision. But one impression example. But those words, urgent and important, they sure matter, just like how the word priority matters. We need to define the words we use, and we need to use them consistently so that when a team is confronted by a stakeholder or customer or product owner that uses one of these words, they're able to correlate it with how quickly they need to act on that item.
And then they need to step back in retrospect on a periodic basis.
Yeah, totally agree. So we're rounding third, heading home. Two links here for everybody. So the first is the link on the left to go purchase our Mastering Work Intake book. Right here from J. Ross Publishing. Came out in January. We've been teaching a cohort course as well for this, and that's the link on the right. So looking for you to go sign up for our maven.com mailing list. That's the platform we're using to host these classes. We're probably going to be offering another cohort in September, so stay tuned for that. But if you hop on our mailing list, you'll be the first to know about it.
And we really hope to see you there.
We do.
Jeremy, as always, this was illuminating, and I now know that it is obviously the most important thing that I do, that I find somebody else to weed that darn garden and get back to that strategic plan.
I'm sure you can find a camper to do that, Tom.
Well, they would have to do it while marching, though.
That's true. So maybe we could just have a stream of them. Walk up, do a little weeding, walk up, do a little weeding. That's why everybody gets steps. Everybody
collaboration. This is why
go.
Collaboration is really great. Until next week and our next session, have a great week.
Bye, campers.